Press the bell icon on the YouTube app and never miss another update from Sebastian Fitness Solutions. When it comes to how much rest you need in between sets at the gym, there seems to be a lot of confusion on what's right. The general idea seems to be that if you want to get stronger, you've got to rest longer, around 3 to 5 minutes or so. On the other hand, if you want to focus on muscle gain, that is hypertrophy, then what's recommended is that you keep your rest interval short, maybe around 60 seconds or less. In today's video, I'm going to discuss whether this idea is correct. What are the real factors that go into determining how much rest you need between sets? And finally, what is the optimal rest interval for you between your workouts? Coming right up. What's up everybody, this is Sunit Sebastian from Sebastian Fitness Solutions coming to you from YFC IC Colony in Mumbai, and in today's video I'm going to be talking to you guys about the optimal rest interval between sets for muscle and strength gain. Now when it comes to this concept of how much rest you need between sets, there are a lot of generic numbers that are thrown around, like 1 minute of rest or 2 minutes or 3 minutes, and typically it's done based on what goal you have. So if your goal is to gain strength, the typical recommendation is to rest for 3 to 5 minutes so that you're completely recovered and that you can lift a maximum amount of weight in the next set. On the other hand, if your goal is muscle gain, hypertrophy, the general suggestion is to keep those rest intervals short so you can take advantage of the metabolic stress side of things, aka the pump, which is one of the factors that influences muscle hypertrophy. The question here is this legit? Now the thing is that there's a lot that goes into how much rest you need. There are various variables that determine how much rest you actually need between sets, and I'm going to first cover those variables right now. The very first variable, the very first factor to consider is the nature of the exercise. That is it a compound exercise or an isolation exercise? Typically compound exercises require more rest because they involve multiple muscle groups to be trained. They involve higher technical execution and coordination in dealing with those multiple joints that are moving. They typically involve a greater amount of load to be handled. So given these factors, they typically tend to require more rest than isolation movements would. The second factor to keep in mind is the technical complexity of the exercise. For example, let's take two exercises, the deadlift and the face pull. Both of these exercises are compound exercises. Yet the deadlift is a lot more technically complex to perform than face pulls. Deadlifts have a lot more cues to be followed. There are a lot of mental checkpoints that you have to keep in mind to make sure proper execution is in place. You've got a lot of focus that you've got to put into that movement to make sure that you're doing it correctly, and it is a lot more taxing to the CNS than face pulls would ever be. So given all this, and again the CNS is a very important part of this equation, because when the CNS is taxed, you will underperform without a doubt and are a lot more susceptible to injury even if your muscles are fresh. So basically higher CNS fatigue or more CNS intensive the movement is, the more rest you would need. The third factor to look into here is whether the movement is a supported movement or an unsupported movement. Now this factor isn't really as significant as the others, but it does make a difference to a certain extent, where you've got, let's say for example, a bent over dumbbell row and a seated row. Both of these exercises work the same muscles, that's the lats, across the same function of shoulder extension, yet the bent over dumbbell row would require a little bit more rest to recover from because it's a little bit more CNS taxing, given that your body not only has to perform that movement, but it also has to stabilize your core in that position, which is challenging compared to the seated row where everything's supported. So yes, it's not as much of a difference as the other two mentioned before, but this would also make a little bit of an impact on how much rest you would need between sets. And the fourth and final variable I'm going to discuss here is your training intensity, and this is a very, very important one. Let's compare the exercise of a squat, but one person doing a 15 rep max, one person doing an 8 rep max, and one person doing a 1 rep max. The difference in intensity is so vast here, and the amount of rest that they would need would correspondingly be very much different, with a 15 rep max being such light load that you can get away with just a minute of rest or maybe a minute and a half, whereas a 1 rep max would probably need upwards of 4 or 5 minutes of rest maybe to recover. Right? So higher intensity, more rest period, right? So these are the various factors that go into how much rest that you would need in between sets. Now given all this information, you could compile it together and give a basic guideline that one could follow And you could probably set it up something like, if it's an isolation exercise for moderate to high reps, like 8 to 12 reps, then maybe 1 minute of rest is all that you need, because it's not very taxing to the CNS, it's not very technically complex to execute, it's not, that way. So you may not need as much rest. Then the second case scenario could be a compound exercise, a regular compound exercise with a moderate rep range of 6 to 8. In this case, you may need about 2 to 3 minutes of rest, depending on the lower end being for the supported movement, and the higher end being for the unsupported movement. And another way to look at it is to look at the structural lift. So if it's a squat or a deadlift and you're doing it for like a 5 rep max or something, then you probably need about 4 minutes rest or more to completely recover and do your best for the next set. However, I'm going to stop you right there. I'm going to tell you to leave those guidelines aside, stop right there, forget about it. Why? Because the optimum amount of rest that you need between sets is the amount of time that you need to be 100% physically and mentally prepared to do that next set. You see, we can look at all the various variables that come into play that theoretically affect rest intervals, and you may come up with a certain number, but ultimately what really matters and what the one confounding variable is how you feel at any given day at that time for that particular set, and that makes all the difference in the world. So let's say you're looking at a theoretically normal or theoretically good rest period of 2 minutes for you, but at the end of the 2 minutes, you don't feel physically and mentally prepared to that next set. Then you are not ready, then you're not recovered, and you need more rest. Similarly, if you are supposed to rest for 3 minutes between 2 sets, but at the end of the second minute, you feel like you feel completely ready to crush it, then by all means, you're ready, go for it, Don't hold yourself neurotically to a certain set time, or don't time yourself on a stopwatch and follow that neurotically, because ultimately what matters more than anything else is how you feel at that given day, and you should be listening to your body more than anything else. There are a lot of variables and a lot of theoretically sound variables that we can look into, but ultimately how you feel and listening to your body is the best way to go in this scenario. Now, looking into the research side of things, because that's also important here, there was a lot of research done in the subject of optimum rest intervals. And a lot of that research is actually contradictory. And that's mostly because you can chalk that down to flaws or problems in methodology among other variables. But there's one study, one fairly recent study done about last year, that's a brilliant study. It was done by Schoenfeld et al., Dr. Schoenfeld, Brad Schoenfeld. And in that study, they found that rest intervals of about 3 minutes, that is a longer rest interval period, led to greater gains in muscle and strength than the shorter rest interval period of 1 minute. And this kind of goes along with the idea that was discussed before, and the only reason you can pinpoint that to is the difference that the shorter rest interval group couldn't perform as much weight or for as many reps in subsequent sets than the longer rest interval folks did, which further reinforces what I discussed before, where performance is what matters more than anything else. If you're not 100% recovered, if you don't feel 100% ready, your performance in the subsequent sets will suffer, and ultimately that will affect your training load, the amount of weights into reps that you've lifted, and that would indirectly affect your gains, or actually directly affect your gains. And enough to the point where it seems from this study that this difference in training load seems to override and supersede whatever little advantages in metabolic stress that you could have gotten had you taken those shorter rest intervals. So ultimately, this study also reinforces the idea that you should be resting as long as you need for you to be recovered. And typically, the guideline that they've found pretty much is that a 3-minute rest seems to work pretty well for recovering. So that's basically it. You gotta, instead of focusing and neurotically worrying about how much exact minute you need to rest between each sets, use this as a reference, start with a 3-minute reference, and then more importantly, adjust it up and down depending on how you feel. Listen to your body. When you feel 100% ready physically and mentally to crush that set, that's when you go and dominate. Now, with all this being said, there are a few caveats that I would like to talk about that, go against, not go against, but yeah, that you should consider when you're taking this advice from me, but these are all for practical reasons. The very first being, just because I've said that you need to rest as long as you need to, doesn't mean you take that rest for too long. If you rest too long, your body's going to cool down, you're going to lose focus, and that's going to affect your performance just like not resting enough would. So don't take it overboard. Make sure that you rest just as much as you need and not too much more. The second thing to consider here is that if you're really hard pressed for time, let's take for example, you're going to train early in the morning before work and you have a very small window of time that you can train in the gym and you've got to fit everything into it. Well, the very first thing I would say there is you need to look into your program first and make sure that you're not doing too much, trying to fit too much into one workout. That's the first thing you look into. But beyond that, let's say you've gotten a reasonable amount of work in that 1 hour session, then you may also need to slightly adjust the rest downwards just so you can get the workout done. Now this is purely for practical reasons, you're making a compromise here, but again, it's keeping in mind that it's better to do that than to skip sets or to not do enough volume in that given day, right? And the last thing would be focus and discipline. Now if you're someone who happens to stroll around the gym and chit chat and talk to people and play with your phone in between sets and you lose track of time as you do it, then you definitely want to time your rest, not for the fact that you want to stay at 2 minutes or whatever, but just as a reminder so that you know that you got to go and do your next set and you don't waste too much time. And again, this is not a problem of rest intervals as such, it's more to do with you not having the discipline. So stop socializing, stop fooling around the gym, focus on your workout and get that done, right? So barring all this, the advice that I said before holds true, where you would rest as long as you would need to feel physically and mentally prepared to do that next set. And that's what you should follow. So that's it guys, that's the video for today. So once and for all, if you want to know what's the optimal rest between sets for you, it's the amount of time it takes for you to feel 100% ready to go ahead and crush that set. But if for those of you who want to know a number and you really want that and you can't do without it, then start with about 3 minutes and then kind of scale it up and down depending on what works best for you. So I really hope that you found this video informative, and if you did, don't forget to give this a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed already, click that subscribe button right now. Go ahead, click it. And share this video with others so they can benefit and learn from it too. And that's all the time I have for you today, but until next time, keep learning, keep growing. Hey, thanks for watching that video. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe. Also, follow me on my social media. All the links are down below in the description. And finally, to watch another video, click right over here.